Okay, this panel is to be chaired by Professor David Luke, who is a professor in practice and strategic director at the Firouzlaji Institute for Africa, LSE, and extraordinary professor at the Northwest University, South Africa. He is an expert in Africa trade policy and negotiations, and he has advised governments, built partnerships, and led capacity development initiatives. His career spans a number of companies and organizations, including the African Union and the UN, with key roles in shaping the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreements. You have read How Africa Trades. Now let's hear from the person who wrote How Africa Trade as he chairs this very distinguished panel. Let's welcome Professor David Luke.
Thanks for that rather generous introduction. And not going to inflict the same thing on the panel, since you all have the programs and you have the bios of the panelists. But let me just briefly begin by introducing the panel. Eugene Nizeyimana, who is CEO of the Africa Business Chamber. Welcome, Eugene.
Thank you.
Colette van der Ven, who is founder and director of Tulip Consulting and an international trade lawyer, and I should also say research associate of the Firouzlaji Institute for Africa. Welcome. Andrey, who is an analyst at Risk Insights and, of course, one of the sponsors of this event. And last but not least, Kekeli Ahiable, who is with the Tony Blair Institute and in the trade practice. I can abbreviate your background and affiliation. Like a good teacher, I don't want to assume that everybody knows what green trade policies are. So let me begin with 1 minute teaching on what green trade policies are. Basically, green trade policies are interventions that are aimed at disciplining carbon emissions that are embedded in international traded goods and services. Different countries, different firms have different approaches to fixing a price or recognizing the externalities that are embedded in carbon emissions. Now, because you have all these differences, it's a bit of a mess out there because these instruments that are being used range from emissions trading schemes to the pivots to clean energy to even the purchase of carbon credits and even taxes on fossil fuels. So, in order to bring some coherence to this mess, the European Union, as the first mover, has developed some instruments that the rest of the world reacting to, instruments for bringing about greening trade policies. So basically, this is what we're talking about, these instruments that the EU has developed and how they're shaping responses across the world. I was remiss in also acknowledging that we have Abrie du Plessis, who is on the line. Abrie is a trade lawyer and an associate of Tralac, the Southern Africa-based trade law center. And in fact, Abrie, I'll be starting with you. What are these key instruments that the EU has developed for greening trade policies?
Thank you, Professor Luke. Let me spend my 6 minutes by giving a bit of a perspective on what we call these green trade policy instruments and where they fit in and what they are. I think the first thing that I have to point out is that the green trade policies or interventions of the European Union are essentially national law. They are both in the form of an EU regulation. They are national law in the framework of national law versus international law, but they are quite unique forms of international law. Why? Because even though they are national law, they are driven by the international conventions on environmental issues, and they are affecting trade in goods. In other words, they are affecting or impacting international law on the trade in goods. And we therefore have to understand that these two regulations that I'm going to talk about, the one, the EU deforestation regulation, and the other one, the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, they are national forms of legislation driven by environmental international law, affecting international trade law, and yes, as you rightly said in your introduction, they sincerely hope to have an international influence, maybe to become the international norm over time, maybe to create the coherence that everybody is looking for, but at this point in time, how they will be followed is not that clear, and how the coherence will eventually be achieved is not that clear. Now, I made my point about the difference between international law and national law for a specific purpose. Because until now, when we've been looking at issues on environmental issues, on trade law issues, we have mostly been dealing with international law, public international law. Public international law has certain well-known concepts. Asymmetry is a well-known concept in public international law. Nationally defined contributions under the Paris Agreement is another one. National circumstances and conditions you commonly find in international law. Common and differentiated responsibilities you find in international law. And also clear references to developing countries and least developed countries. When you look at the two EU regulations that I'm going to talk about, being national law, you do not find these concepts in them. And this is one of the issues that I think the panel will look at today. So what are the two regulations? I've mentioned them. The first one is the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's important to note that this is not an EU carbon taxing system. The EU already has an EU carbon taxing system called the Exchange Traded System, or ETS. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is a regulation dealing with the consequences of the ETS. And what it tries to do is, it tries to achieve an equivalence between producers in the EU paying carbon taxes and importers sending products into the EU, then also being required to pay up an equivalent sum of money in order to achieve equivalence and equality. The deforestation regulation is also quite interesting. It is focused on the consequences of deforestation. Why deforestation? In the case of the ETS and the CBAM and carbon taxing, it's commonly known that carbon dioxide emissions are the major issue in climate change and global warming. And likewise, in the case of deforestation, the International Panel on Climate Control reckons that 11% of greenhouse gases can be traced back to deforestation. So what the deforestation regulation does is it puts in place requirements for products which have a connection to deforestation before they can be allowed to enter the European Union. Now, what is interesting about the deforestation regulation, and very noticeable, is that it has a definition of deforestation which is unique to the EU. What it means is that if in the country of origin the product is perfectly legal because it did not breach any deforestation rules, the product can still be denied entry into the EU because it breaches the EU's definition of a deforestation event. So this is quite a big step for the EU to take. Now, the other point to make about this, about these two regulations, is that when we are talking about public international law on climate and on trade, we have all these provisions, all these exceptions, and very much a forward-looking picture, very much a fixing up the future sort of picture. But when we look at the CBAM regulation, it is looking at legacy issues. It is looking at major industries which have been contributing excessively to greenhouse gases. It is looking at the grids of countries, electricity production, the source of electricity production. So in a bit of a quick shift, the emphasis is shifting to what is there now, what has been there, and what can be fixed in a relatively short period. Because when you look at the deadlines and the ambitions of both the EU and the international agreements, it is clear that it is a step to convince governments not to think about dealing with something at some point in the future, but to deal with issues now, both on the side of certain industries found to be extraordinarily polluting, with the issue of moving to Scope 2. Scope 2 means that the way you produce electricity in a country will be counted for embedded emissions, and that will have major impacts in certain countries in Africa. And then also on the deforestation issue, moving now almost at a short notice into the concept of what is produced now, even though legal in the country of production is not allowed into the EU. There is an immediacy to both these issues, which in my view requires countries to take a completely new look at just energy transitions, at the actual plans that they are working on now, at the actual engagement they are working on now, at the absence of the commonly known concepts of asymmetry, differentiated responsibilities, and so on and so on. Now, in conclusion, I'm just going to say, and it will come out in this panel, I think, a bit of a question is, do you protest? Do you cooperate? Do you try to change? Do you ask for a redesign? Do you want changes in the timing? Do you want mitigation? Do you want collaboration? Very, very difficult one. And as you can imagine, there has been many voices going up trying to challenge these two regulations. First one, of course, was fine. It is driven by environmental protection, but it is in breach of international trade law. The response was simply, well, there are other forms of international law which are as important, like environmental international law, and there are additional national priorities and circumstances which overrule trade law issues. So this is a major, major debate. And it means that countries in Africa will have to deal with this from 2 points of view. First, the flow of their trade of goods to the EU at this point in time, as we speak almost, if you look at the short timing coming up. Secondly, how these two regulations, and specifically the CBAM, may change the world in terms of countries having put in place carbon taxation, also putting in place CBAM equivalents. Massive issues on the grid. The moment you go to Scope 2 and you start counting the carbon or the gas used to create electricity in as embedded emissions, you have a major, major issue for most countries. Some of them are luckier than others. That has to be taken into account, and that is the overall picture. So in a way, while on the one hand, the environmental international agreements were going their own fairly slow way, raising issues, while carbon taxing were becoming quite common worldwide, these two regulations, and specifically the CBAM, has upset the apple cart and has pulled the African continent from a place where it has not been before, which is equivalent treatment to everybody at a short notice on issues existing now with possible consequences, serious consequences for sectors and for economies. And this is where we are now, and where the question is, how is this taken forward with the European Union to start with, but maybe also in the international context to try and mitigate and manage some of the issues we are seeing here. That is my starting contribution.
Yes. Thank you very much, Abrie, for that. I think you set the stage very well. I'd like to turn to Colette, so move from one lawyer to another lawyer, so to say. And two questions I'd like to put to you, Colette. Firstly, the EU has not stood still. You know, these measures are still evolving, so perhaps you might want to elaborate on that. And then, as Abrie has said, these are, well, he said national. It's a national law, we might say a unilateral initiative, but they have not yet been tested at through the WTO dispute settlement system because it's broken and so on. But Abrie also makes a good point that these are measures that do not respect the norms of international trade law, that do take into account different capacities, responsibilities, and so on. So with your lawyer hat, maybe you could just give us a sense of how things might play out, should, you know, in relation to compatibility with WTO law, but then also just give us, you know, again, an overview of how things are evolving at the EU.
Sure, thank you, David. Just putting this here. And thanks everyone for being here. So I think I'm just gonna take it where things were left off in response to David's question. So the stage has been set very well, all right, in terms of what is, say, the deforestation-free products regulation and what is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? And I just want to get a sense, who has heard of the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism? Okay, so a handful of you. This mechanism has been really important in the worlds that deal with trade and sustainable development for the reasons that we heard just now. But they've also been subject to quite a bit of critique. And I know that my fellow panelists will be elaborating a bit on that. But this has really become a very tricky part of problems for the Commission in Brussels. Perhaps even more the deforestation-free products regulation than the CBAM, for reasons that one requires how you produce a good, right? So it really gets into what do you do when you're producing your cocoa or your coffee or your palm oil? How do you use and comply with that definition of deforestation that's in that law, which is becoming conditional to enter the market, right? So if you are a smallholder farmer in Côte d'Ivoire, you know, you may not be able to comply with that. And you have to have traceability systems in place, etc. And you probably already have deforestation-free products initiatives, but they're not taken into account, right? So a lot of complaints have been raised about the unilateral nature of this, also the lack of inclusivity with which a lot of these measures have come into play, the difficulty of compliance, the costs, and the fact that it's treated developing countries a bit like a one-size-fits-all, right? Without, or with complete disregard for the fact that, say, a big soy or palm oil producer in, say, Brazil or Indonesia is very differently positioned than a smallholder coffee grower in Ethiopia, right? So, as David was saying, going to his questions, the conversation on these issues has not been resolved, right? Countries have vocalized their critique, the Commission has engaged, the issues are still on the table. However, to complicate it even further, we're in a slightly different universe today than we were when these regulations were first implemented, right? Because those two regulations were implemented as part of the EU Green Deal, right? Under the first mandate of von der Leyen in the Commission, where green and green trade was really a priority, right? But now fast forward, the second mandate, it's no longer driven by the EU Green Deal, but by the Clean Industrial Deal, right? And the words say it. What Europe is pivoting, or the way Europe is pivoting, is a world that has that central green component to a world where what's much more important is ensuring competitiveness of EU businesses, economic security, resilience, etc., right? And I'm mentioning this because within that shift, these remaining issues, about which we're going to hear more, and the implications for African countries, now need to be resolved within that shifting set of political priorities, right? And that creates both opportunities and challenges. So for those of you who are following this, you see that in the context of the European Union, there's now something called an omnibus package, where basically, in response to some of the complaints against CBAM and EUDR, the Commission has basically said, well, we've got to simplify, because the bureaucratic burden is such that it really undermines businesses' ability to compete. So, for example, on CBAM, under this omnibus package, it is now exempting businesses that are trading goods up to 50 tons a year, right? So the smaller businesses, essentially, smaller EU businesses are not required to basically buy these carbon declarations, right? That's huge. They say that at the same time it makes sense environmentally because you're still covering 90% of the emissions, right? Because you're basically just excluding those that are not really emitting. So these are ongoing conversations coming from Brussels. There's similar things happening on due diligence and probably on the deforestation free products regulation. We're going to also see things, right? Is this a good development? Is this a bad development? And for whom, right? What are the implications of this for African businesses, for example? There's not a lot of talk actually right now on that from what I've seen. And some might say it is great because not everyone will be subject to having to comply with these measures, right? But it's yet to be seen on how and where this will fall. There's also an argument to be made that says if you're exempting a certain subset of businesses, could that inadvertently hurt those businesses, especially in what we've heard earlier today as well, the importance of going green long term, not only for the benefits of the African continent, but also for remaining competition and competitiveness, right? I'm going to leave that just as a question. Turning to the other things that David asked me, another really important element that's come out is a new way in which the EU is now engaging with partner countries as part of its Clean Industrial Deal. And this is a new model or new partnership that it's called Clean Trade and Investment Partnerships, CTIPs. And that is supposed to be not as comprehensive as a free trade agreement, but a little bit more integrated in terms of a value proposition the EU offers. Very interestingly, we don't know much about what this can look like, but 2 weeks ago, the Commission's President von der Leyen was in South Africa to launch the first of these partnerships. And what the EU is really interested in here, if you read a bit between the lines, it's accessing the green hydrogen and investing in that, right? As well as the raw materials. And South Africa is very well positioned to develop green hydrogen, as we've heard today as well. So now, coming back to these unilateral measures, to what extent does this shift in priorities create more of a strategic opportunity for different African countries to engage with the EU, right? There might be an opportunity there, especially with regards to those materials, and because the need is there for the EU to go and create those partnerships. So that might create a bit more leverage on the African side, including also on the EU green trade measures. I haven't yet covered the WTO question, but I can save that for the next round unless you want me to quickly talk about it. Yeah. Great. Okay. So that's on strategy and politics, and we can talk about that for a lot longer. On On the legal side, so I'm just going to put my legal hat on here, the CBAM in particular, but also the EUDR, but there have been a lot of voices that say the way that the carbon border adjustment mechanism has been designed is incompatible with the WTO rules, right? The Commission will flat out deny this. They say we've designed this completely in accordance with all the rules. There is a likelihood that this case will at one point end up in the WTO dispute settlement system, even though that system is not fully functioning right now. India might, for example, be a country quite interested in looking at this. How such a case will be resolved is yet to be seen, but there are some areas of potential weaknesses in the way that the CBAM has been, not only designed, but perhaps in which it would be applied. So I'll just point out and I'll point at one, the steel sector right now in Europe is not actually subject to the emission trading scheme, right? It's exempt. They're going to gradually phase that sector in while they're also phasing in the CBAM and its applicability to other countries. The question is, how will this go, and will there be situations where you have an exempted, say, EU steel industry, yet a covered business in the industry, right? That could potentially be discrimination. There's a few other areas where you can have potential discrimination, including with regards to, for example, default values. If you cannot directly calculate emissions in your product, then default values will apply. If those are adverse, then that's not something necessarily automatically okay. You're gonna go to an exemption, and I'm almost done, an exemptions approach in order to justify such discrimination. This is called Article 20, and there arguments can be made by the EU that what they've designed is consistent for various reasons with the objectives set out in the trading scheme, but there are arguments on the other side as well. I don't think we have time to go into this, but that's where the battlefield will be, and I'm leaving it here.
Yeah. No, I think you're giving a good overview. Kekeli, I'm going to turn to you. I think both Abrie and Colette have hinted that there are costs for African countries as they try to comply with these measures. But at the same time, it has to be said that the future of international trade will be green, inevitably, if we want to live in a planet that's livable. So from your point of view, what might be the benefits of these sorts of measures, but also what are the costs, especially in regard to compliance?
Thank you for that. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so maybe let me first of all say, premise whatever I'm going to say by just saying I am it's very important to support climate goals and the green transition. That's very important. So whatever I say after that should not take away from that.
Yes,
I am in agreement of that. Now, having been in industry for years and still work with governments and industry across the continent, my position, which also aligns with what a lot of people say, again, this is just one side of it, is really that African countries should not be prioritizing just transition goals over the need for industrialization, over the need for energy, which you need to be able to industrialize. So that's really just my starting premise, period. Why do I say that? I'm going to repeat a few things that we all already know. Africa is a continent. African countries are, majority developing countries, LDCs, are in Africa. Africa needs socio-economic transformation. We need to develop. To be able to do that, we can't avoid trade. We can't avoid industrialization. Trade drives the global economy. Today, over close to 60% of the global economy is driven by trade, pretty much. And so we can't get away from that. When you look at the data, the statistics of economic complexity of countries, like what we're producing, Africa, we all know, we're sending out all the raw materials. Our economic complexity is really, it's low. So we need to work on that. We're not a continent that's asking questions around how do we move away from debt in our industry, because we don't even really have industry in the first place. And so we're a continent that's answering fundamental questions about just industrialization. How are we given the space to industrialize without having to deal with just He's like, well, almost every time you're about to start something new, another thing comes in, like, this is what we need to do. And so, just to put that out there, the costs and benefits, well, I guess that depends also on what actions are we going to take, what can we do. So I'll start with the costs. And again, I've been in business, like almost everything that comes, like there's a cost to it. And so whether we're talking about lobbying, which Colette mentioned a bit about, and I think the previous panel touched a bit on, that's money. Like everything is going to cost money. And so if it's lobbying, that's money. If it's taking the issue to the WTO or joining China or India, who are bigger on that, like it's still going to be money and time and resources. If it's, there's also the argument about finding replacement markets. If it's that, it's also going to be money, because if currently your systems are developed towards a certain market, and then all of a sudden now you have to think, okay, how do I ship to my, like Mozambique is probably going to be asking, how do I ship to my aluminum exports from the EU and find new markets in Asia, wherever? That's all going to be, it's just going to be a lot of cost. And even in terms of the replacement markets, like we talk, the AFCFTA, again, a lot of conversations like throughout the sessions have centered on that, which is amazing. I think that's something we need to be focusing on as well. Even that, like building that's, if the replacement market is more intra-Africa trade, that's cost, because currently, even our foundational trade, there's the need for improving trade facilitation. We don't have, 38 of our countries pretty much have maritime borders, the sea. We don't control any of that. Like there's work to be done there. Our highways, even connecting to the landlocked countries and the hinterlands to be able to trade, that has to be done. Crossing borders, border procedures, like there's so much to be, like it's all cost. The costs are costs. It's gonna cost us a lot of money to get stuff done. Maybe then I guess I'll talk about some benefits.
Sure. No, I think this is a very nuanced response, that on the one hand, there's justification for African countries prioritizing their own transition and industrial development. But then there are all these other issues that need to be taken into account. So how you juggle all of them. No, I think thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to you, Eugene, and the question is, can we envisage a global trade system that rewards countries for greening their production?
Thank you. Just to echo what Colette said, I do agree. Of course, Africa faces a mix of unique challenges, micro and macro, ranging from, of course, climate change. From the north, we have desertification, we have infrastructure, transport issues, we have governance issues, we have energy issues, access to energy in Africa in some countries below 50%. So when we are benchmarked with some global economies, it's not fair. So COBAM has been one of the debates, because it's not fair for Africa when you're trying to benchmark European countries with African countries that face a bit different or unique microeconomic trends or challenges that are not, so we're not benchmarked at the same time. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a policymaker, I'm a businessman. So my role is to translate policy and regulatory into strategy. How can we create value and drive economic growth? And in terms of AfCFTA is a very great initiative to drive economic growth and create opportunity for Africa. Especially if you look at some of the international policies, like COBAM, majority of European policies stop at the border. So if you look at things like sustainability policies, let's say, for example, if I give an example of electric vehicle, if you're in the UK, they tell you, or Europe, they tell you, oh, this is sustainable, is energy friendly. But when you look at the whole supply chain, where the lithium is being mined in DRC, in Zimbabwe, those things are not accounted. So when you look at the policy in the West and they only look at the border, okay, we are eco-friendly. They don't look at developing economy, how it's impacting our local issues. Earlier on, I was hearing a lot of issues around discussion around the current conflict in Africa, DRC, and a few other. And most of it is to do with minerals. If you look at it, that's why even Trump is fighting in Ukraine to talk about minerals. If you look at the trade wars in Africa that are to do with minerals, DRC, I don't want to go politically, but I've worked in DRC, almost 20 countries in Africa. I know the dynamics around that. So the reason why US is setting up a Lobito corridor is to access minerals from DRC, Zambia, to ship them to US, because there is a Tazara. So FCT has come in to create an opportunity to support interregional trade, to see how we can add value to the African continent. Because of few unfair trading agreement that are around the global economy, WTO, I think we are represented. I think our voice in the WTO is 3%. So most of the policy don't favor us when we talk about global policies. Most of the commodities are in Africa are not well priced. So we all know issues around all the debate going on around cocoa, how is it being underpriced and overpriced. We all know the issues around minerals like uranium, how French recently were being accused how they're exploiting Africa, selling, buying uranium 90p, while on the market is around over $100. So those kind of trade are not fair for Africa, which is why Africa does not progress. So we believe an initiative like AFCTA is a good initiative to bring Africa to trade internally. And invariably, of course, this will help to reduce carbon emission, because if it costs, for example, I'm from Rwanda, it costs a container 3 times to transport it from Dar es Salaam to Kekeli than from Europe to Dar es Salaam. So that's carbon emission. So if we can create value locally, produce some of these minerals, raw material locally, we can actually contribute towards green policies in a more practical way, meaningful way, where we are also adding value locally. A good example, I was invited to, before President Magufuli passed away, we were invited to look at the value addition in Tanzania, especially things like cashew products, which were being exported to India and Vietnam, and then produced and then sell back almost 10 times. So we look at the cashew product. One cashew product we could convert into 15 products: cashew juice, cashew nuts, cashew oil, cashew vinegar, lots of things. Oh, this is what we call value addition. Same conversation now, we're talking about production of processing lithium, mineral. I'm involved in a conversation, look at how do we manufacture battery fuel cells in Zambia or other countries in Africa to add value. Yes, FTA is a good initiative, and quite a lot of conversation has been talked about. Of course, it faces its own challenges. As you know, it's a regional organization, but of course, there's it has an opportunity to promote green trade, to add value in terms of some of the policy they are currently implementing, promote regional collaboration and cooperation to champion low carbon and other things. However, one of the key challenges that FCTA face is also conflicting with other regional economic communities. So we have 8 other regional communities, COMESA, ECOWAS, and these are conflicting with each other. So we need to look at making sure that they are working in harmony in that way. Let me stop there.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. No, I mean, you talk like a businessman. What you're seeing issues that need to be sorted out, but then also you're saying, you're making a very good argument that intra-African trade would actually be greener because it has less of those costs that are associated with transport and so on outside of the continent.
And to add to that also, sustainability or climate change initiatives are not cheap. They are quite expensive. Even in Europe, most of the business cannot afford some of this sustainability. So, and in Africa, the challenges with climate finance is still a challenge in terms of funding, and so being, especially in terms of energy access. Another example I was involved in 2 years ago in COP27, when we were looking at UK came to promote net zero, and African were asking how where we transitioning from when access to energy in Africa is below 50%.
Yeah, okay. I think we need to go to Andrey, because I think Andrey has been looking at me as if to say no.
No, not at all. I actually was thinking what Eugene is talking about, how it resonates with what I wanted to talk about. So mine will be very short, please.
Okay, Andrey, the question I want to ask you is a slightly different one from what we discussed earlier, but I want to ask you, how does the weaponization of trade that we see currently complicate efforts to have a rules-based green trade regime? So, with this new transactionalism and so on, could we ever arrive at some consensus? Keep in mind my initial premise that the EU, these measures that they're taking, is aimed at creating some coherence on green trade policies, but now we see this new transactionalism. Is it complicating? Would it help? What?
Thank you. Well, I think it would be difficult for me to make such a big judgment, whether it's EU versus the Africa. We quite a small organization. We are a data science company which is collecting, we're largest on the continent, collecting ESG data as well as providing the ratings across the 9+ different countries in Africa, and we are representing about 20+ countries in Africa. So if you look at I think the shift in European policy was good in terms of the last amendments. They're obviously simplifying the life of the many importers into Europe, because I had a privilege to have a conversation with one of the clients. It was literally a few days before this event. And the client was in one of the African countries. They're exporters, and they're exporters of one of the, actually covered by CBAM. I was very surprised, and they're not small. I was very surprised to hear from them that they had no idea about CBAM. And when I asked the client, because I was surprised, I said, look, maybe you don't know, because they're supplying Germany and a few other European countries, please, could you place a call maybe to your importer, because you will not be affected per se. Yeah, even though your importer was supposed to tell you and work with you on the plan for you to be ready, a couple of days later, happened to be, again, I know the company, they placed that call, and on the other side was also, apparently was quite a long silence, and then they said, yeah, we will let you know a little later, don't worry, it's still okay. When I explain it's still okay, but it's actually tomorrow what's happening, and they unfortunately, even after the new proposal, they're still part of what needs to be paid. And we know the client, they're energy producing about 60 to 70% from solar panels. And the client said, but it's not a problem because my solar panels. I said, but do you have certification? Of course we have certification from the local company. I said, are you sure that your local company, and again, we're not in this business of consulting, we are rating agents, we're very independent. It was just a question, more friendly conversation than anything else. And the person said, not really. I know that we have a local one. I said, could you double check with them? Just, again, a matter of interest and obviously hedging for you going forward, if they have all papers required by the European Union, without criticizing European Union, don't take it wrong, A few days later, had a conversation, the answer was no. They don't have anything. And to me, that's example of the very good, completely unsynchronized events which were supposed to be for good of Planet A, because we don't have Planet B, as we all know. I wanted actually to vote today, but since it's too late, I'm not going to run for it. Planet A and Planet B, I hope we're all in agreement that there is no Planet B. So we're on the Planet A, which is the only planet, unless people are planning Mars expedition and a lot of people planning to join, We are on this planet and we have no idea. Yet we are a phone call away and we're actually living almost in the same time zone. And some countries actually in the same time zone, Africa and European Union. Completely unsynchronized. I digress slightly now, if you don't mind, to make a few points, and then I will jump to the answer to the question. I think things being unsynchronized for a long time. But when we started the movement globally in terms of the greening and ESG overall sustainability, Europe was leading the way. But the way, and again, that's a problem of the leader. Because when the leader is running fast, because Europe was running very fast. In some countries faster than others. We all know who were champions in Europe, who actually was a little bit on the backseat and taking backseat for many reasons. Yeah. So Europe was trying to pull together Europe behind that Green Deal. Yeah. The issue there was that leaders sometimes forgetting about that passenger who is at the back to advise where we're accelerating. And again, I cannot speak for the rest of developing countries, but Africa was definitely that passenger on the back, which was supposed to be a responsibility on both sides. Passengers were also supposed to look at the driver and say, hang on, you're turning, I'm not ready. Your turning is great, but what do you need from me to assist you? Yeah, with that turn, because maybe on that turn, I will be actually thrown out through the window, okay? And at some stage, Africa was behind in terms of the synchronization. And if you look at, again, I'm going now to the fundamentals, when it started is, when you look at the frameworks, we are living in the world of about 400 plus frameworks. Out of these 400 ESG frameworks, where companies, countries, regions evaluated against lots of ESG different factors, and about 350 common factors, more or less. None of those frameworks, maybe one or two, actually was born in developing countries. They were born in the United States, interesting enough, lots of them. Some of them born in major ones. Some of them were born and developed in the European Union. Countries like our 50 plus on the continent, their interest is very low carbon countries. Because we're very low, we all know that. We have a super advantage. Producers of the raw materials which actually are required for green transition by the world, that's just two pieces, never being taken into account properly when those frameworks were built. Because European Union was rushing, and rightly so. European Union was doing a great job. However, what it leads, if I look at now at CBAM, which we discussed today, and I made a few notes before this conversation on the CBAM specifically. When Africa, and I've heard it a number of times today, which was absolutely fantastic, Africa is not standing anymore with a begging bowl. Africa wants fair trade and fair investment policy. If I look at the CBAM, which is again great, absolutely fantastic regulation, problem when we look at when interest of particular group of the countries, and we know that Africa is quite big in terms of the European Union basket for export-imports, when it's not taken into account and responsibility on both sides, it's definitely leading to complete misunderstanding. When Africa is greening, but at a much lower pace, and European Union, technically speaking, would be extracting money, which otherwise Africa was supposed to get as revenues, without clear mechanism how this money will be reinvested back to Africa, it's leading to two things. One, the most important, is mistrust, and it's even worse. And second one, Africa, I'm sure, will start industrialization, but Africa may take also very selfish position. I'm not suggesting we should, but may take very selfish position and say, okay, we're on our own. We will be doing all kinds of dirty industries here because it's cheaper, and employment and the social responsibilities to our people are the most important priority for us. Since European Union is not returning money, which are now taken from our, what otherwise supposed to be our export revenues. Second one is, I mentioned that, regulation. There are not that many Africa-based institutions which are actually certified for the carbon trading. If again, jumping a little bit to the carbon trading now. That's why my conversation, I was not surprised. When people are having 70% from the solar panels and they're not certified. So basically they will be disadvantaged even though they are very green. I'm not engineer, sorry. Obviously, in my understanding, they're quite green, yeah? But even for this piece, they will not get credit. Last not least is the sad part we have a discussion with a very big export-import partner of European Union. And that was pushed from the both sides. From Europe, because that particular partner of European Union is bigger, and from that country, that European Union took into account, and green taxonomy, I'm jumping a little bit between documents, but it's actually interconnected. Green taxonomy of that big export-import partner of European Union and European Union green taxonomy, 75 to 80% align. And what it means, just to give you a very, very small example, very little example. All green bonds which will be issued by that particular issuer will be considered green bonds in Europe and vice versa. So it's a green light funding tomorrow for that particular partner. Africa, I think 1 or 2 countries, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 2 countries, have a more or less mechanism there. But when we are misaligned on foundation, it is very, very difficult to continue saving one planet, because we are more and more starting to live on 2 different planets. And how much anyone living on that planet, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in Africa, would win from that misalignment, I'm not sure, because planet is one.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was overrunning.
Yeah, no. Thank you very much for that. I think one of my takeaways is that we live in an era where there's also mistrust. I think that's a very important point. I think we only have about 10 minutes left for the questions. 10 minutes left for questions. We'll take as many questions as possible, and then we'll just have a final wrap-up by the panel. Yes. The gentleman in front, and then I'll go to you. Yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm a student.
Do say your name, affiliation. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm a student here at LSE. So I was just wondering, given that CBAM makes exemptions for raw materials, but includes costs for processed materials, so there aren't costs associated with iron ore, but there are with iron. How will this impact Africa's efforts to move away from raw material exports into higher value added material markets?
Okay. I hope Abrie also is hearing the questions, so we would have a final response by the panel. Did you hear the question, Abrie?
In my case, the question was, I couldn't hear it.
No, it was not directed to you. I'm just making sure that you be part of the final response. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Ruben Lendo, and it's been a pleasure to actually hear everyone's opinions and thoughts concerning this. My question is concerning the understanding of the trade agreement of the green trade policy, because of course when it comes to policy, it requires engagement from all parties, from those actors in the supply chain to the end. So are the terminology, the definitions, but also the language in those trade policies inhibiting people from actually engaging with the policy itself? Because it shouldn't be right that people should just see the aftermath of the policy but not actually understand the prior effects to it as well. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Janet Mulu. I'm a international trade and sustainability consultant. My question is to the panel. Thank you very much for all your presentations, by the way. I'm very closely related to his question around the understanding of trade, of the green policy, how that's understood from the ground. But also for me, it's to ask your, what does the intersection of this regional trade agreements and sustainability mean, especially when you look at the AfCFTA, which probably initially wasn't focusing on this, yet now we have to kind of bring in together the element of sustainability into trade agreements. So how does that impact on some of the agreements that are already in place? Thank you.
A very interesting question. Anyone else? We can take one more.
Hello, sorry, I'm up here.
Yeah, okay. Good for you.
Hello, my name's Max Olamondi. I'm a practicing structural engineer. I found some of the discussion quite interesting on the topics of industrialization in Africa and the aspiration to achieve net zero, and essentially the framing that they are mutually exclusive. We cannot do one or the other. We've got to choose, and Africa has pressing needs right now. So I wanted to understand, how can we in African nations industrialize in a green way, which is actually economically beneficial? Why must we view it through a skeptical lens and say, well, Britain have industrialized traditionally through the Industrial Revolution, we've seen it with China, so therefore this is the only way. We need to sort that out first, then we can worry about net zero later, when actually the effects of climate change affect us today. So I just wanted to get some thoughts on that.
Thank you for that. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the far end of the panel and then go through the panel and end with Abrie, who started us off. So Kekeli.
Okay, maybe I'll take
Any of the questions, you don't need to answer all of them, but just be selective.
I guess I'll take the last one, because I guess I was probably the strongest on, or seeming to be in an either or. It's not, I agree, but the reality is Africa accounts for less than 4% of global carbon emissions. Sorry, I'm not going there again. So the question is, how can we industrialize in a green way? I mean, obviously I'm struggling to find answers, because, and I'm just mentally going through, even when you take the maritime industry, for instance, we're talking a lot about the shipping industry's decarbonization, etc. Although the shipping industry accounts for only 3% of carbon emissions globally, there's that push for decarbonization. Up till today, there's conversations about, we can use ammonia, there's green hydrogen, there's a lot of them. I can't even remember all of them, but when you ask the question of, are any of them available in commercially viable quantities, or it's no, right? So the jury is still out there, there's still R&D going on, all of that, right? And so for a lot of all these, the answer is, at least to the to the extent that I've found them, it's hard to answer. But take the fact that, there's also the conversations around carbon sequestration. We do have a lot of carbon sinks. We do have a lot of great big forests all over the continent that are already contributing to green, right? Yeah. And so when you consider the starting point where Africa is today and our realities of we need to create jobs, and for that we need energy, it's just, we have to be realistic. When you look at the global, what's happening in the global space right now, the US is deciding what's best for their people. EU is taking just 30 seconds. EU is doing the same. Asia is doing the same. Africa needs to do the same. We need to be willing to take bold, new, innovative ideas. And if part of that innovation is, okay, we're going to trade, we're going to understand the urgencies of the need to trade with each other. We're going to, look at, okay, I only have 30 I'm thinking about the time, and so I'm just going to get, but it's hard.
I would love to talk to you about it.
For sure.
Good.
I can
so
talk all day about this.
Bilateral afterwards. Yeah. Okay, Andrey, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. I'll start with the last one. I with respect, disagree completely.
Okay.
So to me, a similar question about industrialization, UK, how it was done a couple of centuries ago or later. The similar question was actually asked at one of the events which I had the pleasure to attend at the World Economic Forum, and surprisingly, I did not hear the answer in the room. The answer in the room was, we have to industrialize and it's very difficult to be green because it's too expensive. My answer was on the streets of the little cities. Well, I would call it little, I wouldn't call it little. But in Chinese terms, it's a small city. It's called Dalian, 7 million people. That was the World Economic Forum last year meeting. And they have one of the largest refineries in China, number of them. They have one of the largest ports. It was one of the first free trade zones in China. And it's a third level city. So it's Beijing plus Shanghai, that's the first. Then you have 15 to 20 million people, that's the second, and that's the third. So it's not the biggest, it's not the greenest, and it's not the most advanced. Yeah. However, refineries, not even one day I felt any smell on the streets of Dalian. And refineries, I could actually see them. When I look around on the number of the electric taxis, specifically taxis versus the normal taxis, there was a 50-50 percentage split. So if that economy can convert itself with such an enormous pace, I'm sure we in Africa, because we have advantage of the first entrance, if you like, because we've never been industrialized. So now we have advantage to do it, and to do it in the most advanced and green way. Now I'm turning towards Europe, where we'll get all this funding. And I think it's this argument about us saving the planet. And I can repeat it, I repeat it a number of times in a number of audiences. We save the planet because if not us and a few more countries, this planet would be done. Because this is 4% and over 1 billion people. If we think about consumption in US terms, or even European terms, this planet is done. We would not be able to live here, breathe here. We won't have any water, so it's just a luck. Yeah. So European, as well as the other developed countries, have to pay their debts. And more importantly, if I look at CBAM, which we discussed today extensively, money which Africa would be paying through CBAM, one way or the other, with the new directive, without, whether it would be approved by all country members or not, different story. But all of this money should be reinvested back in Africa, because otherwise Africa will go exactly the way you suggested, which is dirty production, not dirty, apologies, not dirty, I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry, not dirty production. It will go into the whatever it takes to provide people with food and with important and necessities, of course. That's just one little thing, apologies for that. Regional and the trade agreements, that's exactly the link which I think everybody is looking for. That's when we are working in those 20 countries in Africa. We are always looking and trying to connect with authorities as well as with the organizations like your stock exchanges to provide understanding and common ground to have that framework which will unite Africa in terms of the view on sustainability. Not 50 plus views on sustainability. One view on sustainability with one little excuse to the social, because social is very country specific. Environmental is not, and governance is not as well. Governance is exactly the same across the board. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. Colette.
I think everyone is excited by the same questions. I'll try to keep it brief, but on the question about can greening and industrialization go hand in hand, I also agree that they can and they should. And I think just to put something concrete on the table here and where the opportunities are, I mean, we've talked a lot about CBAM and the problems, but it's also an invitation as a springboard for countries, for African countries, to look inward and say, well, where are our own objectives in going green? Because we've got 2063, right, the strategy. Lots of African countries have their own plans about where they want to go. And frankly speaking, sustainability is high up there, right? So even from countries' own set of priorities, it is there. As well as, I mean, the industrialization, the question then is how to merge those, how to bridge those, right? And also how to make the starting points not per se reactive to what's happening elsewhere in the world, but rather to start at home, right? And then look to what extent do I have to do something for CBAM or EUDR or other things, right? So I think that's where a lot of the value is, which we are currently not seeing as much as we can, I think. But at the same time, it's also, of course, I agree there are technical issues and a lot of other things that need to go into this. But if you take the example of green hydrogen, right, which is, at this point is still very expensive, not really commercializable, etc., etc. But going back to the example I used earlier, so the Commission was in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and they announced a 4.7 billion cash, basically, pledge to South Africa, and 4.4 billion of that is going to help develop renewables through some sort of blended financing and things like that, right? And we've heard a lot about the financing gap and the investment requirements and needs. And so that's quite a bit of money right there that's specifically earmarked to help bring up and build up these industries. And that would be an export earmarked situation, right? That hydrogen is predominantly going into the EU, which on one hand, developing competitive export industries is very interesting, I think, also from an industrialization perspective. On the other hand, it creates also new challenges here, in particular vis-a-vis, justice, electricity, access. Also, you need so much energy to create green hydrogen. Is that fair when so many people don't have the access? The marine environment, land grabbing, you name it, the whole thing, right? So I think to bring all of that together is to acknowledge all these different trade-offs and issues, and then sit down, and find a way to better engage and leverage the position, in this case South Africa's position, of having the platinum and having the wind and the solar and all these things, and say, look, we want this in return. We want this investment, and we want to use it to green our own steel industry, for example, right? Because South Africa has one of the really high carbon-intensive steel industries, right? So that would be, I think, potentially an example of where to find ways to bridge all of those, admittedly with challenges. Am I done for time? Okay. I will respond to you in private on your question on AFCFTA. Yeah.
Eugene.
Yes, I know time is not on our side, and I've been given 1 minute. Just two answers. One in terms of sustainability. Sustainability and the green initiative is not cheap. Well, we are excited about hydrogen. From a technical point of view, to break hydrogen atoms, it requires a lot of water. It's not sustainable in Africa when we are facing desertification and other issues. To answer the question in terms of AFCT has adopted a few green policies to promote green and sustainable industrialization, whereas they are supporting manufacturers to adopt smart technology and smart usage of raw materials. There is also a program on Africa Green Innovation Framework that is supporting businesses that are looking to go green in various ways. And finally, of course, AFCTA is promoting regional collaboration and cooperation and regional trade, which means the reduction in movement of goods and services. Instead of going to Europe, that will be moved along the region, which invariably will reduce or promote low emission.
Thanks, Eugene. Abrie, last word.
Thank you. If I can have the last word, I think what I've found very interesting to add on to what I said in the beginning is if we start out by these two regulations being national law unilaterally creating international issues because they are A, based on an international set of conventions, and B, they affect other international conventions, then I found the whole idea of the EU moving on to a clean trade investment partnership mode very, very interesting. Could it just be that even the EU is saying that it has learned so much here that it has to move to this next CTIPS stage instead of pushing too hard on the more unilateral CBAM type approach?
Yeah, that would depend on the partners negotiating with the EU as tough as the EU negotiates with them. So I guess that would be the answer to that question. But this would be another way of approaching these issues. Thank you, everyone. We could go on much longer, but clearly time is not our friend. And thank you so much. Well done.
All right, and one more time, let's appreciate Professor David Luke for chairing this panel masterfully again. I mean, we have so many master panel chairers in the room today.